my grateful thanks to you for being here this evening. You did have a choice. You could have watched Boris and Jeremy on the television, or actually you could have watched The Crown on Netflix. So thank you for being with us. I think Micheal and I would have been somewhat mortified if you'd chosen the other options. It's a really great pleasure to welcome you and to thank Paul, who's the interim chair of the Institute, the Dean for facilitating us, and Kathleen James and those working with her for putting this evening together. I'm personally very grateful to them. I'm particularly grateful to Micheal. I was going to describe you, Micheal, as having come from Dublin through Oslo back to Dublin, but actually you're now living in New York and you've come across to London for a couple of days, and this is an essential part of your visit. So thank you for giving up an enormous amount of time and commitment to do this. I promise faithfully to Micheal that I would pronounce his name correctly, otherwise he was going to, in a truly Irish tradition, call me Plunkett rather than Blunkett. But you know, we may slip into it during the course of the evening. It's an interesting moment because when this was all set up and Micheal and I were asked if we would contribute, we weren't aware that we were going to be slap in the middle of a general election. But with the public dialogue as it is, or the lack of it, it is appropriate, I think, to be exploring not just poetry, but all that goes with it and alongside it in terms of the spiritual and the reaching out into something that we don't always think about when we talk about the political. I'm going to let Micheal do the proper introduction because he's going to talk about his extensive over 40 years, well over 40 years, but 40 years in the public eye, of his contribution, not just to poetry, but poetry and music, poetry and Christianity, poetry and that wider emotional contact. And I agreed to do it because I'm desperately keen that we should try and get back to people feeling in their hearts as well as in their heads what it is that they expect from the political dialogue and the political arena. And I hope we'll be able to explore that tonight. You're going to be an essential part of this because it is a conversation. And Micheal's going to, I think, help me out, because one of the things about chairing is I'm fine while I'm speaking, but when I'm spotting people who want to speak, I run into a slight difficulty. And brilliant as the guide dog Barley is, he's never quite mastered being able to woof in the right directions. So Micheal's going to do that little bit with us as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, before we go any further, please welcome Micheal O'Siadhail.
Thank you for your kind words, David, and may I also join your thanks to all who organised it and did all the practical things. Kathleen James was the person I think I dealt most with, so thank you all for that. Now, the Westminster Institute, as I understand it, and as Paul outlined for us, it concerns itself with matters of moral and spiritual courage, and with the compass of public service, both in the case of individuals and of institutions. Indeed, when I looked up this event, I saw if there were to be a shortage of seats, which I noticed there isn't, preference would be given to public servants. So we're here in Parliament Square with the Palace, Whitehall, the Supreme Court, and of course this Abbey. With so many servants, public servants about their business here, the air must constantly ring with, "Yes, Minister," or even "Yes, Prime Minister." This puts me in mind of a very early lyric poem called Spring, which I published in my first ever collection of poems. Though the season may be wrong, here in the Abbey, I still thought I'd like to read it as a sort of tiny prologue that says a kind of yes, Minister, to the ultimate minister. Spring. I saw one morning at 9, a bird on the run for all it's worth, from tree number 1, a public servant moving heaven and earth to see his master's will is done in tree number 2. And almost unbeknownst to me, if I hadn't heard on the grapevine that he'd a wire from his minister to tell how another year returns. Nothing amiss, just as everything should be, it is. So I want to also just, as a preliminary, pay tribute to Dr. James Hawkey, the canon theologian, and to Claire Foster Gilbert, the director of Westminster Abbey Institute, who unfortunately can't be here this evening, for conceiving this series of dialects on art, imagination, and public service, and in particular for daring this pairing of cabinet minister and poet on the theme of ruling from the heart. I'm very aware, David, Lord Blunkett.
David.
Good. I'm not good on lords. So I'm very aware David has so much experience of governing with all the pressures and responsibilities that this involves. I, for my part, work at a far more contemplative level. However, I'm not a complete innocent. I will remind, I have in time had a taste of both academic and of arts politics. And I'll remind you all that Harold Wilson, the leader of a party which you, David, served, once remarked that he had left academia and gone into national politics because academic politics were far too dirty. Now, in the invitation to speak, which I received, I was told that the aim of the programme was to explore ways in which the arts can offer those who rule and run the country non-utilitarian ways of seeing the world and of responding to it. Let's suspend for a moment how the inspiration for poetry and working out of an inspiration might parallel a ruling from the heart. I want, in fact, to approach it from a different perspective. I suspect I was honoured with this invitation because in my work I range from the intensely personal to exploring public themes such as the Holocaust, globalization, and language. But perhaps my latest book, The Five Quintets, is most relevant of all to this dialogue. I spent 10 years writing The Five Quintets, which is a Dante-like meditation on modernity, in imagined conversations with the movers and shakers over the last 400 years or so. There's a quintet on the arts, economics, politics, science, and theology / philosophy. I think all those involved in public service will know how all these themes interweave a polyphony we call society. Yet I still think it's worth separating out each of these themes in order to ask, in the light of examining the arts, economics, politics, science, theology, and philosophy, throughout the period of modernity, I think it's still worth it to try and get clues as to how we might best rule from the heart. Contemplating artists over the past 400 years, I am convinced that the greatest keep both heart and mind in tandem, hold both emotion and intellect in tension. I have in The Five Quintets George Herbert, who knew the world of ruling and was one of the finest poets ever, in my view, in the English language. I have him say, "I know my worth, I know power's thrill and sheen. For me no sour grapes hang too high above. I know too well what mirth and music mean. I know the ways of learning, yet I love." Surely for rulers and administrators, the temptation must be to take too rigid a stance, to be too unbending, to be crayon, refusing burial rather than Antigone yielding to her compassion. For the sake of neatness, for the sake of absolute consistency, it must be so easy to forget we rule not for the sake of ruling, but rather to further human flourishing. Literature painting, sculpture, and music must allow us to rule from the heart, to remain in touch with our own feelings, to ensure we don't lose compassion, joy, and abandon. As I asked the ultimate minister in the epigraph to the Five Quintets, in words and hues and tones, please play in me the grace to know how in your complex glory we let go. What then is the case in economics? Clearly, good management of resources is part of ruling from the heart. Looking at the major figures in economics across modernity, it became gradually clear to me that neither totalitarian ideologues nor free marketeers rule from the heart. I believe that the best economists, and I'm thinking here of economists such as John Maynard Keynes or Amartya Sen, I firmly believe that ruling from the heart involves both justice and generosity. The head demands justice, the heart demands generosity. As in my ventriloquism in the Five Quintets, I make Keynes say, I've been a civil servant and I know so much is chance and how most change is slow. I peak between the crash of 29 and World War II, and forced to switch my tack, I think beyond the ledger's bottom line. Or to return to my epigraph, where I address that ultimate minister I alluded to before, show how an open hand is worry-free. Spark again your love's economy. Your generous first words spoken, let there be. The third theme in this societal polyphony which I'm trying to describe, the third quintet, deals with politics. And clearly this is central to ruling from the heart. There's no doubt, but we have to steer the ship of state. We have to rule. Yet reviewing the 400 years or so of modernity, the curse has always been extreme ideologues, both left and right. Extreme ideologues have been ready to sacrifice all on their altar in the hope of starting with some tabula rasa, believing that we can wipe the slate clean, that we can start from scratch. I'm convinced that ruling from the heart means in politics to keep seeking the best combination of realism and of compassion. Realism without heart risks simply becoming arid and inhuman. It can fall easily into those hollow utilitarian ways that this series encourages public servants to rise above. On the other hand, heart without realism seems to me to be doomed to fail. And I can only think of the flower power movement of the 60s, which went simply nowhere, only to be followed by the swing to that great ambition of the go for it generation which followed. Alongside this fusion of realism and heart, I think we need the humility to know that all our best efforts fall short. I think of the Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, the mending of the universe. There is no perfection. To rule from the heart, we have to be happy just to keep on trying to make the world a little less imperfect. As I engaged with the lives of politicians throughout modernity, several stood out for me as having the moral and spiritual resources to change, to journey towards deeper understanding. Among those were Gladstone, Gandhi, and Mandela. And I imagined Gladstone saying, "Dare I ask if you all journeyed too, Speaking for myself, I know I did. Though Prime Minister, you I lead, first the Tories, then the Liberals. After all, I spanned a century. Once High Tory under Robert Peel, I believe that church and state are one. I become a Liberal who tries slowly to remove barriers of both class and creed that still curbed growth. Church of Ireland's disestablishment I achieved, though many disapproved. I introduced the secret ballot box. So although Home Rule for Ireland failed, I prepared an empire's unseen end. Even if I'm of my times, I guide people towards another century, following the paths I pioneered. Or to return once more to the epigraph to the Five Quintets. Enhance our trust in hard-earned betterment. Humbler world we may in turn augment in long adagios of increment. Let's consider science, the subject of the fourth quintet. The dream of the Enlightenment was a mechanical vision of complete mastery. Many of you recall Marx's famous dictum that religion was the opium of the people. But one wag said, echoing Marx, progress was the opium of the Enlightenment. And I think we have learned that we're part of nature. Heisenberg has shown us that we can't observe without affecting what we observe. We have to learn a new humility. We can't tie down the subatomic dance. And more, we're still in a rapid technological revolution that has changed our ways of living so fundamentally. What could such technology in a malign regime lead to? Are we in danger of becoming a shallow technocracy? Without a doubt, our damaged and threatened planet must now be our focus. If we're to survive, ruling from the heart in science means a fresh respect for creation, an old wonder, a new humility. While marveling at your choreography, stars and quarks beyond our mastery, we still explore to praise your mystery. The fifth and last quintet, philosophy stroke theology. Perhaps in Parliament Square that it's what this side of the square, what this abbey best can serve if we are to rule from the heart. And if we are to rule from the heart, we cannot ignore the thinkers who have asked the big questions about the meaning of our brief sojourn, who have tried to make sense of it all, who have grappled with the meaning of our tiny lives on this planet. Attempting to think through the trajectory of thought across modernity, I've conversed with many theologians and philosophers. In keeping the larger framework of our existence in mind, how God is envisaged can colour our behaviour and how we might rule in so many subtle and indirect ways. Among the theologians I have my imagined conversations with is Martin Luther. In Psalms and Romans 2 again I find, therein the righteousness of God revealed. As sinners, pardon for our humankind depends on grace, who God decides is healed, and all our own exertions wasted sweat. By faith and faith alone, our fates are sealed. And then there was Karl Barth, one of the greatest theologians of modernity. God is God above our human mind, beyond ourselves and still beyond, and free as light that can delight or blind. And I name one more, a third, another Swiss, Hans Urs von Balthasar, sometimes called the Catholic art. As infants in our mother's smile we learn, for all the gap between our God and us, it is for love's analogy we yearn. If it is really for love's analogy we yearn, we most certainly will side more with the compassionate Antigone than the harder-hearted Creon. Finally, to return to what I mentioned at the outset, just two tentative remarks on the possible parallels between the artistic process and this ruling by heart. I think the first corresponding quality might be courage. In the light of all the great poetry or music or painting that exists, how can anyone have the nerve to think that they can come up with something else? A new work that can stand comparison with previous masterpieces? How can I dare to think I can? Surely to rule by the heart demands a similar audacity. To imagine that after thousands of years of human endeavor, can you possibly propose a change that will make the world a fraction less imperfect? How can you dare to make what is just a little better? For me, a second parallel might be the working out of inspiration. A poem may begin with a mix of a notion and a hum. How that moves along must remain open to the constraints of thought and shape until, holding content and form in tension, it comes somehow to match up to the pressure of that original inspiration. And I can't help thinking that in ruling from the heart, an initiative begins with both an insight into where there's a need and some concept of betterment. Yet similar to the artistic process, politicians must surely navigate between the realism of circumstance and the ideal to which they aspire, until it measures up, at least to some degree, to their initial insight. So now, just before turning to dialogue with David, I'll read an extract from the Quintet on Politics. Our ancients knew, whatever shapes the ship, a state is steered. This is a trope the Greeks, Alcaeus and Aeschylus, long ago prepared for Plato's Republic, where, with their metaphor refined, he tells us how we sailors on such unknown seas that toss and change must choose a helmsman for our ship. For him, philosophers are best to helm. The fantasists of left and right both fail to see how states must ground stability, how institutions take so long to grow. Yet like a tree on leaf they too can wilt, and neither Marxists nor free marketeers, despite their fantasies, can find a way to keep what's brutish, nasty, brief at bay. Perhaps we learn a little from the past. Though paradigms of history repeat, they also shift or slowly rearrange the models we assume, so we can know something of what's best and so can build from age to age as wisely as we may. Let's try to trace our own trajectory. For though we can no longer now believe in linear advance, we still may learn from stories of adaptation and mistakes, aware how we arrived at where we are. Refining our inheritance, attuned anew to what is new, we dare to change. Then where is poetry in politics? So many counted syllables in all the cut and thrust. No more, and yet no less than lines in our polyphony of thought that shapes an ambience in which we act. To shape adaptations we may learn to dare, and no one knows how syllables are weighed. We travel towards a star we're steering by, to one imagined harbour's havened dream. So that's my piece done, David.
I just wondered after that where to start the conversation. But I think I'd like to start by picking up the observation you made before your readings about where we are and the Parliament Square and the sources, historic and present, of influence and power. We're missing only, aren't we, the Bank of England? They really ought to have had that here as well. And you've linked that to the way in which, you mentioned flower power, there have been many events recently, the Extinction Rebellion, of those who have a cause but don't necessarily know how to or wish to link it to the formal political process. And we've seen that over generations. One example of where that did work was Make Poverty History, wherein leading up to 2005, there was a real upsurge, particularly as we have today, from young people with a passion, with a desire, not a mechanistic view, but a real commitment to the inequality that and overcoming the injustice in the world. And some progress was made, because that massive cross-border campaign did actually lead in July 2005 to commitments made in the G7, overtaken by the attacks on London in that July, and it has to be said by the diversion of the winning of the Olympic Games for London, but a real commitment to debt redemption in Sub-Saharan Africa and the beginnings of a real international debate on climate change, which had begun some years before. And I just wanted to explore that with you. How can we link the passion that exists, the oratory we used to have and doesn't really exist in the same way now, where people used to have to use the arts, sometimes the black arts of oratory, and feel unnecessary to do so now, and link that passion and that feeling to the reality of decision making. Any thoughts?
Well, I 100% agree with you. See, I'm a product of the 60s. I came to manhood in the 60s when we all believed we had the answer to everything. We were going to change the world. We knew exactly what was to be done, and there was, but it was a terrible naivety, as I was suggesting earlier, because I don't believe, as you're suggesting, that anything changes with this passion. It was, again, do you remember that movement of the banks, where they all got outside the banks, and it spread across the world after the fall, and everybody thought something was going to happen. Of course, nothing happens, because they don't actually get into the institutions and change from within. So it's how, I don't know what the answer is, but certainly I think you're right. It's how to harness that extraordinary idealism of youth and passion to believing that it is possible to change through the institutions which have been there and are there.
I suppose in essence, we're talking about trying to draw on the well of humanity inside people. I had the privilege of meeting Nelson Mandela 3 times, once for a brief period on my own with him, because he'd been invited in his later years, when he'd stepped down as president, to an event here in London, and much to my surprise, wasn't really being looked after, and he and I were having a quiet cup of tea and feeling, well, he was feeling his age and I was beginning to feel his age as well. And the sheer humanity of that man just came out from every pore. You could feel it, you could sense it. And that not only obviously was a major contribution to seeing him through those terrible years on Robben Island, but also to the humanity and healing process that he was able to bring to South Africa. So there are real examples of people who have managed to hold on to that despite the brittleness and the thick skins that we all find are developing around us when we're in positions of power or authority or influence. I just want to give an example of my own, and then perhaps people could be thinking about that while we continue the dialogue. I haven't said this publicly before, but when I was Education and Employment Secretary, having to follow rules and finding it much easier to be in the straitjacket of following rules, because the minute you step out of them, as I found later, you can be accused of all kinds of things that actually cause you great grief. This was an occasion when I was approached by part of the family of a young woman who'd just taken her GCSEs and was waiting for the result. And they told me that her mother was dying, and it was quite likely, given the prognosis, that her mother would die before the August date when the GCSE results were sent out. And would I somehow get the examining board to let the mother have the results, because everyone believed that this young woman was going to do really well. And I was advised very strongly not to, and decided that there was no point in being the Secretary of State if you couldn't actually do things. And there's a twist, as there always is in these tales, and I persuaded the examining board under very strict conditions that they would supply the results before they were announced. And I informed the family, who then told me that the other part of the family thought this was an extremely bad idea and that it was likely to disrupt her final hours, and would I not do it. And I only use the example of how I'd put my neck on the block only to find in the end it was chopped off. And the difficulty with this is that you then become more immune from appeals to the heart, as you've been describing it, Micheal. The tendency to go back into the refined box and to take advice when you're asked not to do things clicks in. It didn't do this completely, because when I was Home Secretary, there was a school trip from a school in Rotherham, and one of the parents approached me to say he was an asylum seeker, and his son was the only one in the class who was not going to be able to go to France because he had no clearance of papers and therefore no means of returning. And was there anything I could do about it? And I reminisced a bit in my head about the previous occasion and talked to the very good civil servants in my private office, and we decided that we'd find a way of doing it. And he did go, and he did come back, of course, and his father was eternally grateful. So there are times when you can break the mold and you get some satisfaction back, but all of us are human. So if there'd been a second occasion when things had gone badly wrong, I suspect I would literally have gone back in the box. You want to reflect on that?
Yes, no, I remember when I was on the Arts Council of the Republic of Ireland, that the director used to always say, what was the saying? Hard cases make bad law, was what he always said when you wanted to make an exception. Hard cases make bad law. But it is really a question of discernment, but I'm sure you're right. If your discernment, if you go on the side of the angels and get yourself into trouble a couple of times, I'm sure you get very immune. But just to double back to Mandela for a second, if I might, I wonder really when you talk about keeping that well within him and so forth, and Mandela is somebody I engaged with in the Five Quintets, and I read his is it Long Walk to Freedom, I think it is, extraordinary book. But I wonder, is one of the qualities which kept that alive in him the fact that he made an effort to understand the people who were actually imprisoning him. In other words, he used to share his fruit garden. He had a garden with vegetables. He used to share it with the warders. So I wonder, is that ability to to understand the people that you disagree with and are fighting against. Does that help, do you think, to keep that spirit alive in someone?
Yes, but it takes the most enormous personal understanding, not just of your enemies, but of yourself, to be able to do that. And one of the things I'd like to share with you is how difficult it is when you're in the thick of the most difficult issues. I was made Home Secretary by Tony Blair in June 2001. We had a number of events. Some of you will remember Thompson and Venables, the young men who'd murdered James Bulger, and the parole board decided that they would be released. I'd only been Home Secretary 3 weeks. You can imagine the Daily Mail and Express and, well, most of the media actually were on my back. But it was rapidly followed by the 11th of September attack in New York and Pennsylvania. And I found myself not overwhelmed, but shut out from the things that had been really important to me in private. The ability to read poetry, to listen to music, to understand the connection with nature and birdsong. And I found it really hard to hang on to those normal human traits that actually do leaven us and make it possible for us to be rounded. And I still today look back and think, was there more I could have done to have clung on to those really critical elements? I mean, back in '92, I'd been in Parliament for 5 years, and I was a front bencher expecting to be a minister in the Kinnock government that we expected to be elected in April 1992. And we had this massive rally in Sheffield, which wasn't the cause of us losing the election, by the way, but was a kind of seminal event when Neil lost the plot and the television news famously had him shouting, "Are we all right?" And, we weren't all right, actually. We were beginning to lose the election. And when we did, I came back from the count, where of course I'd been re-elected, and I went outside, it was dawn, and I heard a blackbird. And what struck me and inside was that the world was still going on, that for most people nothing had changed, that the world revolved, the sun shone, and nature continued to struggle to survive.
That was the bird in tree number one.
Yeah. And I just want to explore for a minute that connection. You've had poetry set to music. I, long time ago, far too early, did Desert Island Disc. Are you familiar with it?
Oh, I am indeed, yes. Yeah. The Americans have it, and I once did it in America. So.
Right, well, I haven't managed America, but I did manage it.
They imitated the BBC.
Yeah, and it was a bit unusual. I don't know whether they'd allow you to do it, because I had a commentary of the last time Sheffield Wednesday won the FA Cup, which was a long time ago. And I had Round the Horn, a comedy programme with, Sandy and his friend doing a comedy programme. But I also had a poem, or only an extract, but an extract of a poem set to music. It was by the Spanish composer, poet Lorca, and I call it My Little Wooden Sword. And I listened to it, the extract, the other day. Just happened to find a tape with it on, and it struck me that through poetry linked to music, and with that link to the natural environment around us, we could reach people in a way that we don't often think about. At the moment, I doubt if the manifestos over the next 5 days will make more than a nodding, passing reference to culture of any kind. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we were, as well as providing free broadband, promising that we would elevate poetry and the understanding of well-being in our schools? What do you think to that?
Well, I mean, certainly, my roots of poetry are in the school books. I mean, that's where I still remember the poems that I learnt when I was 8, 9, 10, and I just thought it was pure magic. And the rest of my life has been shaped by that. And if you're not exposed to that possibility in schools, if you're not given the excitement of poetry, I don't think you can feel it. So it's very, very important that it's there. It might even be there earlier, which actually wants me to ask you a question, if I may, David. I know you were deeply involved in this this movement, this preschool movement when you were in power, and I, from what I understand, it's being completely dismantled or falling apart. So even at that stage, I think the exposure to music and poetry and so on must be something that, if you don't have it in your background, can be given at that stage.
Well, the Sure Start program, which the late Tessa Jowell and I put together with very good officials, endeavoured to do something more than simply breastfeed a child well. It was about really nurturing both the newly born baby and as they became toddlers, but also to engage the parent or parents, so that it was a holistic approach where people were sharing together. And really at that very early stage, understanding language is a prerequisite, isn't it?
Of course.
What we're talking about tonight. And to be read to. Nothing more wonderful is there in the world. Even now I find it wonderful. Occasionally when I can persuade her to get my wife to read to me.
Yes. I read to mine constantly.
She's very lucky because you've got the gift, as we found out tonight, which is wonderful. Well, you would have, because you're Irish, so there's a bit of prejudice on my part.
I also noticed, if I can interrupt for a second, that she sleeps much better after being read to than looking at the flickers, looking at Netflix or whatever. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I tried to write a poem about that when my wife bought a Kindle, and she often wakes up in the night, and I wrote this little lyric about having lost my love to a Kindle. Its light was shining at night. Anyway, we won't go into that any further. But it was a way of making a point, by the way. Sometimes poetry can make a point. Can I read? I'm not good. I'm not a fluent reader. I'll use Braille a lot for agendas and just notes for speeches. So forgive me if I don't read it very well. And I want to explore with you briefly before we open it up, and we will now. I want to explore what is poetry, because I hear poetry these days, and I'm not sure I know it was, if somebody hadn't said it was a poem, I wouldn't have necessarily known it was. I want you to just reflect on that before we open it up, because this isn't necessarily a poem, okay? But I wrote it when I went to Wimbledon 30 years ago, when Chris Evert and Steffi Graf were in the women's semi-final. And it goes something like this. Centre court, cocooned, warm and comfortable, untouched by accents alien to our own. People who think they own all about them, enjoying the sunshine, melting in the heat. Togetherness, born of easy friendship and shared experience. You can see this is a political poem. The ancient grounds, green and spacious, the scent of strawberries and hay, grass roasting in the midday sun. Centre court, tension, click of ball on racket. The echo, the call of umpire. Quiet, please, we're thinking. And what I was trying to express in that was two things. Yes, the accents were all very much the same. It's broken down a bit over the last 30 years. But to get on centre court for the semi-final, you have to pretty well know somebody. And secondly, how much, and obviously there was no internet then, there was no social media, but I was very aware of that phrase, the echo, because now we have so often an echo of our own thinking, and people echo each other's thoughts on social media. And I just wondered, what your feelings were before we gather the thoughts and ideas and perhaps questions as well of the people who've come tonight.
I'm not quite sure, David, I get what you want my thoughts on.
I want to know what is a poem, as opposed to merely an expression, a stream of consciousness.
Yes. No, I'm with you. Yes.
Yeah.
No. I think the thing to remember always is that it's art. And that means that, if it was simply emotion or a deep feeling about something, you could go up to the top of the hill and let it all out. Whereas in art, you're crafting something, and you're using the tradition of that art to craft it in such a way that you get, to use the classical thing from the Greeks, that you get content and form married. And I think when you get the content and the form to marry beautifully, you've made a beautiful poem. The definitions, of course, are endless. The one friend of mine always described, when he asked what poetry was, he said, it's the stuff that doesn't go to the edges. But I think it's intensified emotion, crafted in a way that catches the pulse of what you're trying to say and communicates that emotion and thought to another.
Okay, good. Now, you're doing your second bit of the evening.
I'm going to put on my glasses for this bit.
Put on your glasses, because I'm not going to be able to help you much. So let's see who would like to contribute, because this is the conversation. So it's not just a question, it's comments and thoughts.
So this gentleman here, thank you.
Good evening. A wonderful, wonderful talk. I've so enjoyed it. So original. Thank you very much, both of you. Would you agree that if you don't know whether it's poetry, it isn't?
When in doubt, leave it out. No. I mean, the ultimate thing for me in all forms of art is, does it move me? Does it leave me feeling I'm a richer human being at the end of it? And while I can often go for, in the Five Quintets, for instance, the first quintet is in haikus, which is a mixture of sonnets and haikus. Which, and nicely, haiku means a fine piece of work in Japanese. But and I use terza rima, and I use iambic pentameter. And then I invent forms. I like the classical and the invention. So I do love form, because I think it does shape, this marriage I'm being talking about does actually, the content is influenced by the form, and the form influences the content, and there's a dynamic going on the whole time with it. I would say I wouldn't at the same time dismiss all free verse. That would be silly. In fact, the wonderful thing about free verse was that the sing-song effect of the traditional poetry and so on was broken. So now when you actually rhyme, you do it voluntarily. It's not compulsory, if you see what I mean, as it once was. But my ultimate test for all art, for that matter, but particularly for poetry, is, does it move me? Does it move my heart and my mind? And does it leave me feeling a little more compassion, a little more enriched? That's for me the ultimate test.
And I shan't add to that. Who else wants to come in?
So I'm here with my glasses on. That lady there just behind, and thank you for that first question.
Hi, I have a question for Lord Blunkett. You obviously presided over quite an interesting time in the aftermath of obviously 9/11, as you mentioned, but also race riots in Bradford and Oldham and Burnley. I'm curious, obviously that began some conversations about integration in the UK. And I'm curious about what role you think that art and culture has to play in producing that sort of national unity.
The best examples of getting people to work together, to understand together, to learn about each other's history and background and their humanity, I have found has come through music, through dance, through art and through occasionally, but not enough, poetry. The best examples I saw in Oldham and in my own constituency, where there was a very substantial influx of Slovak Roma men and women 8 years ago. We're talking about 2,500 people in very short order, was to actually get people to come together through art. And that broke the barriers, particularly with young people, and the dance at festivals, the music, the ability of people to appreciate people's understanding of themselves and their art actually broke that down. It's interesting that you reminded me of I inherited the riots in Burnley and Oldham and Bradford. They'd started during the general election, which is highly unusual, and continued immediately afterwards. And the danger there was that communities had been whipped up into antagonism and division, as we have so much today, by other people who walked away. That has been a historic fact of life, where people divide and they are in a position to be out of the consequences of it. So I think that it's a massive part to play in healing those wounds, but also in getting people to understand that they are just the same human beings, and that their background can be shared and enjoyed together.
So, and I think that works also, David, on a personal basis. I mean, the thing that struck me as a boy with poetry was to suddenly realize that the deep feelings I had were shared by somebody else. I mean, when you read a Shakespeare sonnet about love and you've fallen in love, you know this has been going on for 400 years, 500, you know, and to know you're not alone is an extraordinary function also. I don't like the word function, but it's an extraordinary effect, if you like, of art. I mean, how would you know that when somebody, and very few people go through life, I think, without this, and this, I think, is our common humanity, that very few people go through teenage years without attempting, in the flux of feeling, to write a love poem or to write a lament for a parent or something. It's just some of us never get over it and go on doing it. But I think that's how you know that you're human, you know that you're part of somebody else, and that goes across communities, obviously.
And people who have had the experience of escape from danger, from conflict, or from just unacceptable conditions. R.S. Thomas wrote a poem called The Evacuee. The first line is, "She woke up under a loose quilt of leaf patterns woven by the light." And I think that people able to express their own feelings, their own tragedy as well as their joy. I've often wondered why it is that so much glorious art comes from hurt as well as from love.
I suppose it's two sides of a coin to an extent. But again,
By the way, I didn't pay this young lady to ask me the question so I could find R.S. Thomas's poem. I just happened to got it with me. So.
You're not a plant. So somebody else have a question? If not, I'm going to ask David one. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a question for you both. But Micheal, you introduced us into the winning world of the head demanding justice and the heart demanding generosity. I also wonder if it can work the other way round. The heart can demand justice from a sort of virtue perspective, and the head can demand generosity. I wonder if that opens up two other potentials of contact between the world of politics and the arts. Because if the head is demanding generosity, it opens the space for the imagination to work and for binaries to break down in an interesting way. I wonder if either of you might reflect
It opens the way to breaking the mould, but in politics that is both a plus. I mean, I happen to still believe that I'm a radical. I mean, there are people in the leadership of my party who would take issue with that, but I still believe I am very strongly. but found it difficult because sometimes, and painfully, you had to dissociate yourself from what you wanted to do, because if you changed public policy by the measure you took in creating a precedent, the whole system would break down. I found that really hard in dealing with trying to keep the balance of strong and understandable border controls whilst compassion in relation to asylum and people's needs as refugees. And that, I mean, you felt it from the individuals who wrote or came to my advice surgery, and how to confine yourself within the public policy envelope when you knew that if you broke out of it, you were actually making policy that would then open the bounds beyond anything that's been agreed with colleagues. So I found that really hard. You come across this?
Yes, well, you're obviously talking from, as I pointed out early in what I said, is you're talking from someone who's experienced these responsibilities and all the crux that goes with that. I think on perhaps a more theoretical level here, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, even my saying that is wrong because it's creating a binary which isn't there, you know, to distinguish. And if art does anything, actually, is to break down that binary between the heart and the mind, is to bring both together, you know. So I have no trouble at all in saying that the head is demanding compassion, and that the heart is demanding justice. One of the greatest books I read, actually, I mentioned Amartya Sen as one of the economists whom I really admired. He's a book called Justice, which is an extraordinary book where he discusses all of those issues, and I found him very convincing and very interesting. But may I just intersperse one question to David, and then I'll use my glasses again. But I wondered, just in the present, I mean, I have spoken about inspirational politicians. Can I ask you who in the past, and even dare to say who in the present, you would find an inspirational politician?
Well, I've mentioned the one that is overwhelmingly someone who I could accord that to without any equivocation. That was Nelson Mandela. I've been privileged to have met him. I found Bill Clinton quite inspiring because of his personality. There's no question when he walked into a room, you knew he was there, with all his faults as well as his charisma. I would go back to the time I was a very new councillor, very young, in my early 20s, still a slightly mature student at university. Slightly mature because I was well into my early 20s, but I wasn't very mature at the time. And the leader of the council at the time, a really inspirational guy who nobody will have heard of, was really good at ensuring that he encouraged without patronising. It's very easy when you have some form of disability to find that people patronise you and they don't tell you the truth.
Does he take sugar?
Oh yeah, we used to have that on the radio. There was a programme called that on
That's
Radio
what
4.
I'm alluding to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had it when I was younger. And the people used to speak to my mum like that. And of course, being bumptious and awkward and pig-headed, I used to answer for her, including what she took as well. But yes, you know, those are people who have made a difference. But you know, sometimes it's actually someone outside the political arena. It's a mum who comes to your advice surgery, and she's got 3 or 4 children under 10. And she's living in a high-rise, and she's struggling with 2 jobs to make ends meet, and all she wants is to get some tax credits sorted out that's been going on for months. And that is a person of inspiration, in my view.
Yes, no, I can quite understand that. I'm sure there are other questions. Yes, this lady here.
Thank you. I was just reflecting on, I think, what was said earlier about the fact that we're losing the power of oratory. I think someone mentioned that. And I wondered whether that's actually true or whether we're just not listening to the form that it's taking now. And I'm thinking about the fact that my teenage daughter is trying to persuade me of the value of rap. And I'm thinking about the enormous sort of influence that some rap artists have currently, particularly amongst young people. Would you consider that rap is a form of poetry?
Well, gosh, I have mixed feelings about rap. I have had two teenage stepsons who were big on rap, and I'm afraid the only words I was able to make out were usually expletives. And I also work looking out on the East River in New York, and underneath is what's called the FDR, which is runs along with no lights, so cars coming along, and they stop at lights, or they stop at the corner of the street, and there's forever rap coming out of cars at a very, very high volume. So I have a very ambiguous thing to it. But again, I come back to my thing. Does it actually does it move these kids? Does it make them feel that the world is richer? Does it give them compassion? That's the honest. I can't answer because I haven't heard enough of it or understood enough of it as to whether it does it to me or not. Does it do it to them? I can't tell.
Can I ask you a question? Is your daughter, has she been listening to George the Poet on television? Because he's a rapper. I know nothing about George the Poet, by the way. I don't want to exaggerate this. But I'm
afraid I don't know. She's trying to educate me, but failing miserably.
Well, I think I'm past it, really. On
me too. This one here, thank you.
Just worth saying that George the Poet has done his stuff here in the Abbey.
Oh well, there we are.
Well, then he's blessed.
I just wanted to say I wanted you to say how impressed I was that I'd heard of him. So.
Yes.
Lord Blunkett, you wrote a book in defence of politics revisited, and I mean I think my favourite writer as a young person was Bernard Crick's in defence of politics, who I think you knew. Yeah. I mean, if you're looking at today's world now in this country, what do you think are both the short-term things that are needed in defence of politics and the longer-term things?
Well, Bernard Crick was my tutor and friend. I went to the hospice in Edinburgh when he was dying of cancer, and he was very funny, even in those circumstances. He introduced me to the nurse as his former pupil, not Home Secretary or anything like that. And just very quickly, Bernard described politics as being a messy business in which you would have to get your hands dirty in terms of compromising, but recognizing when you were compromising rather than believing your own rhetoric, and working out ways of countervailing the real sources of power that existed around us. And Barack Obama was saying much the same 2 or 3 weeks ago about the political arena. So I would say, to answer your question, rebuilding a degree of trust. There'll not always be trust in politics and politicians because we fail as human beings, but rebuilding a degree of trust by much greater honesty about what the struggle is and how difficult it is, rather than believing that we can wave a magic wand and it will happen, then leading to disillusionment. Secondly, therefore, trying to be an educator and to explain where the sources of power lie and what we need to do about it. And thirdly, and crucially, that actually we need to engage with active citizenship. If politics is about what's happening in this square, then we're doomed, because people will see it as something that is done unto them, and they expect people to do it for them, rather than they engage with it in a way that actually makes it possible for us to do it together, and that people feel that they're engaged in that political struggle as well.
So I was thinking an awful lot about this the other. I saw, I think 2 or 3 evenings ago in New York, I saw a film called The Report, where this chap Daniel Daniel Day Jones, had worked for 7 years to create a report with 5,000 words and had looked at 6.3 million documents to come up with this report on how the Al-Qaeda people who'd been captured had been tortured and so forth. And it was appalling what went on. It was really, really frightening. There were two almost bogus psychologists who had pushed this whole business of torture, and they got no information out of it. Nothing was proved, but the report has never come out. And I thought, this man must be so disillusioned. There was a summary which was published, and it was under Obama. Now, and this is back to your thing. As a young man, I probably would have said, how awful, terrible. What was Obama up to that he didn't do this? But the truth is, it was much more complex, because he was trying to get Medicare through. He had a whole lot of things that he was getting through at the time, and must have been left with the conflict, saying to himself, yes, this was awful what happened to these people. We should go after them at one level. We should look after the justice. But this was the past. The future was Medicare for so many, many people. And you must, David, have experienced that sort of terrible crux in politics, where you have to, go, where you have to realise that these cruxes exist, whereas I think youth doesn't. I certainly, probably as a young man, wouldn't.
When I've answered as best I can the question you put to me, shall we take one more?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I read a year or two back, or I skipped. It's very difficult when you're doing it in Braille or on audio to skip, but I did, if I'm honest, skip through Eleanor Roosevelt's autobiography. One of the things that struck me about that, because I'm a great fan of FDR, was the struggle he had in concentrating in what he had to do and to carry his party and the country with him, both in the 30s and in the war.
Or into the war.
Into the war, against the odds. When Eleanor was saying to him, but there's still lynchings going on in the southern states. What are you doing about them? And the struggle and the dialogue between them about what he could do and what he could not do in those circumstances. And actually, it made me think, because I never had that stark dilemma, and how you live with that when you know there's an evil that is taking place that you might be able to turn to do something about, but at the price of not being able to do the bigger picture as you see it at the time.
Yeah, that's exactly what I got out of that report. I think the same feeling. There must be another. Yes, this gentleman here with glasses.
Thank you for what's been a fascinating discussion so far. I just wondered if I could play devil's advocate for a minute and think, when we look at the news here every day, we see a lot of inflamed passions at the moment. And say whether perhaps we aren't being ruled too much from the heart and too little by the head at the moment, or whether I've kind of mislocated the seat of those passions and we're being ruled from the spleen a bit more. I don't know.
But the what of it, sorry?
The spleen.
The spleen,
yeah.
I'm going to let you have the last word. You come a lot further than I only came from Sheffield. You've come from New York. 2 seconds, I'll do my bit, and then you can sum up, because I think that's fair.
Well, gosh.
I think that the manipulation of the dialogue, of the use of clever psychology, which goes back centuries, deployed in a way that doesn't necessarily touch people's hearts, but inflames their feelings, and you might want to use the word passion, has been honed over recent years. And unless we understand the interplay of those emotions, that psychology, with the political process and the political arena, we'll see it all over again. It's true from Goebbels, from the clever manipulation through film, and yes, through art in the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s. And we see it in terms of turning people against people by Trump and Putin and in this country today. And if we understand it, then we can counterweight it, we can countervail it by sensible, honest argument, but also to use emotion and passion in a positive sense to turn people against hate and prejudice. That's the best I can do in answering. Over for your final thoughts.
Well, gosh, I think you've made a tremendous contribution, David, and thank you for the weight of your experience in all of this. I mean, I think, what can I say in summing it up, except I think that the balance between in this false dichotomy way of heart and mind, it's a question of how we bring both together, both in art, which is what I see as the ultimate in art, is bringing both together, and how we bring, again, in politics, how we bring the passion that you spoke of with the young people and the form, which is the institutions. So I think the biggest parallel that comes out of it for me is that question of how you get you get the feeling and the form together, and how you can get young people to realize that their passion has to be channeled through institutions which actually change society rather than just letting it all float in the air. And I think that is very parallel to the difference between good and bad poetry in some ways, you know, where we all as teenagers have let out the passion in words and so forth, but the shaping of it, the sweat which it takes to shape a poem, to shape a piece of music, to shape anything of art into something which moves you both through its form and through its content, I think is quite similar. You need to get these two things together, and I think that's maybe the big thought that comes out for me of the evening. So thank you all.
And just to complete, dictators and demagogues have had a real problem over the generations in banning poetry, speaking things that would otherwise have put people in prison. And therefore poetry has a very strong message that can be conveyed in ways that they cannot and have not been able to set aside. Micheal, thank you for coming all this way. Thank you to everyone who's been present tonight and contributed, including by your presence, and thank you to everyone who's made this evening possible.
Yes, thank you all.